Africa keeps breaking its chains, but someone else keeps screaming. A continent rises to reclaim its breath, yet the loudest panic does not come from Bamako, Ouagadougou, or Conakry. It comes from Paris, Brussels, and Washington, capitals that once believed Africa would never wake up. For decades, they were comfortable, predictable, protected by puppet regimes that called their orders reforms, and called their silence stability. But today, that old script is burning. Because something historic is happening. 10 coups in 5 years. Governments collapsing faster than the headlines can catch up. And if you listen closely, there is a pattern. These are not random mutinies. These are not power-hungry soldiers stumbling into palaces. This is a continent rejecting the humiliation of a system that treated sovereignty as a privilege, not a right. The West calls it chaos. But Africans on the street call it justice. They know exactly who benefited when gold left the ground, when currencies stayed chained, when their leaders flew to Europe more than they walked their own markets. The fear we hear today is not Africa trembling. It is the old empire realizing it cannot hold on any longer. If this is something they do not want you to understand, leave a like.
The High Military Command for the Restoration of National Security and Public Order has decided to immediately depose the president, close all institutions of the Republic of Guinea-Bissau until further notice, suspend all social media activities until further notice, immediately suspend the ongoing electoral process, close land and sea borders and national airspace.
Since 2020, Africa has entered the most dramatic political shift of the 21st century. 10 successful coups across 8 countries. Mali twice. Burkina Faso twice. Leaders falling in Guinea, Niger, Sudan, Gabon. And in October 2025, the shock spread beyond the Sahel. Madagascar fell, proving this was no longer a regional issue but a continental awakening. The latest rupture came in Guinea-Bissau, where President Embaló was arrested just as a contested election result was about to be released. A country long described as a narco-state, trapped between cocaine cartels and corrupt elites, finally snapped. These events look chaotic from afar. But inside the continent, people ask a different question: what finally broke the system? To understand why Africa is experiencing a political earthquake, we must stop looking at the visible debris and start examining the fault lines beneath it. A coup is never just a coup. It is the final symptom of a deeper sickness. Behind every headline of a president being detained, behind every midnight announcement on state television, there is a long chain of betrayals, humiliations, and accumulated anger that the world chose to ignore, until it exploded. The first fracture begins with the long shadow of the post-colonial system. For decades, Africa was told it had independence. What it actually had was management. 13 countries locked into the CFA franc, forced to store half of their reserves in French coffers. Foreign troops stationed, for protection, yet the same regions remained unsafe for half a century. Gold, uranium, oil, bauxite flowing out, poverty, instability, and international aid flowing in. It was a system so elegant that it hid its violence behind paperwork, treaties, and smiling handshakes. But people always know when they are being robbed, even if they cannot describe the mechanism. They feel the weight of the theft. The second fracture is the collapse of trust in democracy, not as an ideal, but as a practice. Africans have voted. They have stood in muddy lines for hours. They have believed in promises. But time after time, they watched constitutional term limits rewritten overnight. They watched winners declared while ballots were still being counted. They watched leaders fly to Paris or Washington before visiting their own provinces. They watched national parliaments approve contracts they never saw. In continent after continent, democracy is broken. But in Africa, it is broken and foreign-owned. And that makes the betrayal even sharper. Democracy was supposed to give people agency. Instead, it gave elites a Western stamp of approval to loot more efficiently. Then comes the third fracture, the rise of a generation that has nothing left to lose. Young Africans under 30 make up more than half the continent. They see their resources online before they see them in real life. They watch short videos of gold bars in Switzerland while their schools have no desks. They scroll past clips of European leaders lecturing Africa on governance while their own families cannot afford electricity. And then they see something else, Ibrahim Traoré standing in dusty fatigues, speaking without fear, Malian soldiers escorting French troops out, Nigerians waving Russian flags not because they love Russia, but because they want any symbol that is not France. For the first time in years, the youth see a leader who looks like them and speaks their language, anger. They are not inspired by ideology. They are inspired by humiliation. And people who are humiliated do not act slowly. They erupt. But the most severe fracture is the collapse of regional legitimacy. ECOWAS, once imagined as a vehicle for African cooperation, became a parody of itself. Silent when presidents tampered with constitutions, but loud when soldiers removed them. Harsh on Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, yet comfortably blind to corruption in Senegal or Guinea-Bissau. Its sanctions did not punish elites. They punished ordinary citizens, cutting electricity, blocking trade, raising food prices. People did not interpret this as diplomacy. They interpreted it as a message: ECOWAS will protect presidents, not nations. And when the African Union suspended countries after coups, people asked a simple question: where were you when civilians were starving and leaders were stealing? In the absence of moral authority, power shifts to whoever acts first. And the military acted. Some analysts in Europe call Africa's coup wave a sign of democratic regression. But that analysis is lazy. What is regressing is not democracy. It is the Western illusion that democracy can coexist with neocolonial control. What is dying is the belief that Africa must obey systems it did not design. What is collapsing is the assumption that Africans will tolerate humiliation forever. If you think this is not coincidence but intention, if you believe systems break because someone keeps pushing them, tell me in the comments. Now look at Guinea-Bissau. A country strangled by cocaine cartels, corrupt elites, and foreign manipulation. A country where the military claims politicians worked with drug barons. A country where elections are contested before they even begin. When that system fell, it was not an outlier. It was a warning. Just like Madagascar in 2025. Just like Niger in 2023. Just like Burkina Faso in 2022. These states did not fall. They were pushed. And here is the irony: the more the West condemns the coups, the more the public supports them. Because people know who is truly panicking. Not Africans. It is those who once benefited from a compliant Africa. At the core of this continental rupture is a demand so fundamental that the world pretended not to hear it: Africa wants sovereignty. Real sovereignty. Not speeches. Not development projects. Not military partnerships. Not training programs. Sovereignty means the right to make mistakes without permission from Paris. The right to negotiate mineral contracts without Western consultants. The right to choose allies: Russia, China, Turkey, or none at all. The right to fail and try again. The right to be treated like a continent, not a colony. This is the heart of the coup wave. Not generals hungry for power. Not foreign conspiracies. Not chaos lovers. It is the moment when people finally refuse to be governed by systems that refuse to serve them. History teaches us that when a system cannot reform, it collapses. Today, Africa is not collapsing. The system built on top of Africa is. When you peel back the layers of Africa's coup wave, you find something far more complex than angry soldiers and collapsing governments. What you find is a continent entangled in three overlapping webs of power, each one older, deeper, and more calculated than the last. These coups did not erupt in a vacuum. They erupted inside a political ecosystem designed to keep Africa predictable, pliable, and profitable for forces far beyond its borders. To understand why these regimes fell, we must understand the networks that held them together. The first network is the most visible, the puppet regimes. For years, Africa endured leaders who wore suits sewn in Europe and loyalty stitched in Paris or Washington. They won elections nobody believed, delivered speeches nobody felt, and governed with the confidence of men who knew their protection did not come from their people but from somewhere overseas. They crafted laws that protected foreign mining giants, not farmers. They signed security agreements that allowed foreign bases to remain indefinitely. They turned governance into performance, with the real decisions made behind closed doors between foreign ambassadors and domestic elites. Some of these leaders were not merely corrupt, they were designed, manufactured by a system that rewarded obedience, punished independence, and treated sovereignty as a negotiable asset. Guinea-Bissau is a perfect example. A president surrounded by drug-linked politicians and businessmen, presiding over a state captured by cocaine cartels. Foreign intelligence agencies monitored the flow of narcotics but rarely intervened. Why? Because instability creates leverage. A fractured state is easier to influence, easier to pressure, easier to control. In many countries across West Africa, elites enriched by foreign partnerships were the guardians of this chaos. They benefited from contracts, bribes, arms deals, and development funds that never reached the ground. They were not leaders, they were intermediaries, translators of foreign interests in local languages. But puppet regimes are only the surface. Beneath them lies the second network, foreign powers operating with the grace of permanent entitlement. France, the United States, the European Union, each with its own model of influence. Each convinced of its moral mandate. France built an entire post-colonial system on military bases, economic dependency, and diplomatic pressure. The CFA franc was not merely a currency. It was a leash. Military operations like Barkhane did not merely fight terrorism, they maintained strategic presence. Mining contracts did not simply extract resources, they extracted sovereignty. The United States, for its part, built AFRICOM, a network of bases, training programs, and intelligence operations. Publicly it was about counterterrorism. Privately it was about access, oversight, and positioning in a global competition with China and Russia. Washington trained officers who later overthrew their governments. It condemned coups while funding the armies that carried them out. It preached democracy while its own intelligence reports admitted that stability was often prioritized over legitimacy. In Niger, the largest American base in Africa stood only miles away from communities without running water. The message was clear: security mattered more than sovereignty. The European Union added another layer: economic pressure disguised as partnership. Environmental standards, trade barriers, and aid conditionalities that kept African industries uncompetitive and forced raw materials to continue flowing out instead of finished goods being created locally. Development programs that looked good on paper but preserved dependency in practice. Every grant came with a shadow contract. Every handshake came with a quiet demand. The third network is the most dangerous because it hides in the cracks of the first two, the criminal economy. When states become weak, cartels, traffickers, and shadow financiers move in. In Guinea-Bissau, drug barons used the country as a highway to Europe. In the Central African Republic, diamond smugglers funded militias. In the Sahel, armed groups taxed gold mines and smuggled fuel. Crime became governance, and governance became crime. And foreign powers tolerated it, because instability, once again, creates opportunity. A nation crippled by criminal networks cannot negotiate on equal terms. It cannot resist foreign pressure. It cannot enforce sovereignty. A country overrun by cartels becomes a hostage. And every hostage has a negotiable price. These three networks, puppet regimes, foreign powers, and criminal economies, reinforced one another. Puppet leaders enabled foreign interests. Foreign interests protected criminal systems that served as pressure valves. Criminal actors funded elites and destabilized dissent. It was a triangle of power, stable for decades because the victims were silent. But the silence has ended. When coups swept across the Sahel, they did not simply topple governments, they severed the connections between these networks. Mali expelled French troops not because of ideology but because ordinary Malians no longer tolerated a security partnership that produced insecurity. Burkina Faso nationalized gold mines because people were tired of watching wealth disappear while they struggled to eat. Niger pushed back against ECOWAS because citizens saw sanctions as foreign punishment disguised as regional accountability. Across the continent, people recognized a simple truth: the governments that fell had lost legitimacy long before the soldiers arrived at their gates. They had become custodians of external power, not servants of their own people. And when legitimacy collapses, institutions collapse with it. The West calls these coups anti-democratic. But the truth is more uncomfortable. They are anti-dependency, anti-humiliation, anti-manipulation. The fall of these regimes is not the fall of democracy. It is the fall of a political model built on the assumption that Africans would never demand control of their own destinies. In many ways, the military did not overthrow these leaders. The people did. Soldiers only walked through doors that were already open. Today, what terrifies Paris, Washington, and Brussels is not the loss of influence, but the loss of predictability. A continent breaking free is a continent that will choose for itself. And a continent that chooses for itself cannot be managed. The real question is not why Africa has so many coups. The real question is why the old order thought it could last forever. Because once a people stand up, the only thing more powerful than their anger is their memory. And Africa remembers everything. When you zoom out from the streets of Ouagadougou or Conakry and look at the map from above, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Africa's coup wave is not just an African phenomenon. It is part of a global realignment, an international tug of war between old powers losing influence, new powers rising, and a continent refusing to remain trapped in someone else's geopolitical spreadsheet. What looks like instability on the surface is, in reality, the early architecture of a new world order emerging from the rubble of the old one. Start with the Sahel, the epicenter of this shockwave. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, once portrayed as fragile, impoverished, dependent, are now the beating heart of anti-neocolonial defiance. Their withdrawal from ECOWAS was not simply a diplomatic move. It was a declaration of divorce from a regional bloc that had long operated as a middleman between Western interests and African states. When these three countries formed the Alliance of Sahel States AES, it sent a message so loud that even the most insulated corridors in Paris and Washington heard it clearly: Africa will no longer be managed. It will choose. This shift did not happen in isolation. It happened because the geopolitical incentives changed. For half a century, Western power in Africa rested on three pillars: currency control, military presence, and information dominance. But all three are eroding at once. First, currency. The CFA franc, once a symbol of French stability, is now seen as a symbol of economic bondage. Young Pan-Africanists compare it to a colonial umbilical cord that never got cut. Countries are openly discussing alternative monetary unions, digital currencies, and regional banking systems that bypass France entirely. When gold-rich states like Burkina Faso start refining their own gold instead of exporting raw bars to Europe, the economic logic of the CFA begins to collapse. Second, military presence. The Sahel was the showcase of French military doctrine. Now it is the showcase of French retreat. Operation Barkhane, once described as indispensable, now sits in the archives of failed foreign policy. American bases, especially in Niger, have shifted from symbols of security to symbols of suspicion. The idea that Western troops protect Africa no longer convinces anyone under 40. The story collapsed under its own contradictions. If foreign bases were meant to create stability, why did the instability grow larger the longer they stayed? Third, information dominance. African youth no longer wait for CNN or France 24 to tell them what is happening in their own countries. They use TikTok, Facebook, Telegram, WhatsApp, platforms where narratives spread faster than official statements. When soldiers take power, the first video uploaded is not to state television but to social media, where millions watch in minutes. This erosion of Western narrative control frightens old powers more than the coups themselves. A continent that controls its story controls its future. But Africa's transformation is also shaped by new global players. Russia, through Wagner and political alliances, has offered security support without the moral lectures. China has offered infrastructure without political strings. Turkey has offered drones, training, and investment. The UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia have poured billions into logistics, ports, and energy. These actors are not altruistic, but they are alternatives. And alternatives break monopolies. This is why Western analysts keep asking the same anxious question: is Africa becoming the new front line of global competition? The answer is yes, and no. Yes, because great powers are competing. But no, because Africa is no longer a passive arena. It is a strategist. A negotiator. A player. Look at Somalia, where US troops operate amid growing anti-Western sentiment. Look at the Red Sea, where African coastal nations are recalibrating alliances as global shipping routes shift. Look at Kenya and Tanzania, where China's influence reshapes ports and railways. Look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, where demand for cobalt and lithium has turned the country into a battleground of global supply chains. Every coup, every election crisis, every foreign military withdrawal fits into a bigger puzzle. Africa is the world's last untapped arena of strategic resources and geopolitical leverage. Whoever shapes Africa shapes the future. But here is where the narrative becomes even more revealing. Western governments call the coups anti-democratic. But many Africans see them as anti-colonial. Western governments warn of Russian influence. Africans hear Western panic. Western governments praise ECOWAS sanctions. Africans watch their electricity and food prices spike and ask, who are these sanctions really punishing? Some Western publications claim Russia is orchestrating the coup wave. But this theory collapses under scrutiny. The coups happened because local people rejected systems that stopped serving them. If Russia benefited, it was because the West left a vacuum. Influence follows legitimacy. And the West lost legitimacy long before it lost territory. The most powerful example of this shift is Captain Ibrahim Traoré. His speeches, raw, unpolished, uncompromising, spread across the continent like wildfire. He speaks not like a politician but like a mirror, reflecting the frustrations of millions. When he stands in a simple uniform and says, Africa is not any nation's property, young people feel seen. When he says, we will die standing, they feel represented. It is not ideology. It is dignity. And that dignity is spreading. It is visible in Mali's new military doctrine. In Niger's refusal to reinstate a president who governed from abroad. In Guinea's rejection of foreign interference. In Senegal's youth movements. In South Africa's assertive diplomacy. In Pan-African debates about a unified defense pact. If you believe this shift is intentional, not random, not chaotic, but part of a deeper awakening, let me know in the comments. The truth is simple, Africa is no longer following the world. It is forcing the world to follow it. And this terrifies the old powers more than any coup ever could. Because a continent rediscovering its sovereignty is not just a political event. It is a geopolitical revolution. And once that revolution begins, no one, not even Washington. Not even Paris, not even Brussels, can put the genie back into the bottle. Everyone keeps asking the same question: why are so many African governments collapsing at once? Why Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea, Gabon, Sudan, Madagascar, Guinea-Bissau, one after another? Like dominoes under a single invisible push. But what if we have been asking the wrong question? What if the truth is not that Africa is rising against foreign control, but that foreign control has already collapsed? What if these coups are not the cause of the shift, but the evidence of it? Look closely and the twist becomes undeniable. The old system did not fall because African soldiers stormed palaces. It fell because the system itself was hollowed out, overextended, and no longer sustainable. The empires that once managed Africa from a distance reached a breaking point of their own. And the cracks formed far from African soil. France entered the 2020s bleeding influence, drowning in debt, and losing political capital across the Francophone sphere. Its military was overstretched in the Sahel, drained by costly operations with no public support at home. The United States faced its own crisis: strategic fatigue after Iraq and Afghanistan, economic pressure, political polarization, and a global competition with China it could no longer ignore. Europe was consumed by Ukraine, inflation, energy shortages, and internal fractures. The West was simply too distracted, too divided, and too diminished to maintain the post-colonial order it once controlled with ease. For decades, Western powers could afford to police Africa. Now they can barely police themselves. And suddenly, the coups look different. Not like revolutions against a strong empire, but like the inevitable outcome of an empire too weak to maintain its illusions. Think about Niger. A country with one of the largest U.S. drone bases on the continent. If Washington truly had the power it claimed, that government would never have fallen. Think about Mali. If France still had unquestioned dominance, Bamako could not have expelled thousands of its troops within weeks. Think about Burkina Faso. If Paris still commanded the continent through the CFA franc and long-standing alliances, Traoré would be an impossible anomaly, not a continental symbol. These are not signs of a rising Africa alone. They are signs of a retreating West. And here is the real twist: the coups did not expose Africa's weakness. They exposed the West's inability to maintain the world it built. The puppets collapsed because the puppeteer could no longer hold the strings. What we are witnessing is not just an African awakening, it is the global unraveling of a system that pretended to be eternal. A system stretched across too many countries, too many crises, too many lies. A system that believed Africa would never move because it never imagined it could fall first. When the roots of a tree rot, the branches do not break, they are released. Africa is not drifting into darkness. It is stepping out of someone else's shadow. For the first time in generations, the continent is not asking for permission, only space. Space to define its own future. Space to succeed or fail on its own terms. Space to heal from the weight of a history written by other hands. The old world sees chaos. But Africans see clarity. They know that sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a burden, a responsibility, a risk, a promise. And they are ready to carry it. A continent that was once managed is now marching. A people once silenced are now speaking. And when millions speak at the same time, no power on earth can turn down the volume. The question now is not whether Africa can rise. It is whether the world is ready for what happens when it does. If you do not want this story buried, if you refuse to let truth be filtered through the lenses of those who never lived it, then like, comment, and subscribe. Not for me. For everyone who has never had a voice in their own history. Africa is writing again. And this time, the pen is in African hands.